Get out of here. You don't belong in this room, you filthy thing. Crack. The sound was sharp enough to silence the entire orchestra. In a grand museum ballroom filled with 200 wealthy guests, the violent command and the resounding slap cut straight through the chatter, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. The impact forced my head sideways. The sharp edge of a 5-carat diamond on my stepmother's hand grazed my cheekbone, leaving a stinging trail of heat. For a long, dead silence, nobody moved. 200 pairs of eyes stared straight at me, wide with shock and contempt. My name is Clara Sterling, and that was the greeting I received the moment I stepped inside the Great Hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The occasion was the 30th anniversary gala for the Sterling Legacy Fund, a multi-million-dollar charity established by my family. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive white lilies, heavy perfumes, and unearned privilege. Everyone who mattered in New York high society was there, dressed in custom tuxedos and silk gowns. And in stark contrast to all of them, there was me. I stood just inside the arched entrance, wearing a breathtaking, sleek midnight black evening gown that hugged my silhouette with deadly elegance. No glittering diamonds, no loud jewelry, just absolute, chilling perfection. Standing among a sea of glittering colors and jewels, I looked like a dark queen walking into her own coronation, completely outshining every single person in the room. They looked at me with half-closed eyes, whispering mockingly about the disgraced eldest daughter who had crawled back to ruin their picture-perfect family portrait. But as I looked out across that sea of glittering masks, I didn't care about their whispers. My eyes calmly scanned the security perimeters and emergency exits before locking on to the VIP table near the main stage. Eleanor Sterling, the stepmother who married my father when I was 7, shortly after my biological mother passed away, and who had spent the last 28 years trying to erase my mother's memory while paving the way for her own daughter Audrey, stood panting before me, her face twisted in rage. 11 years ago, a blow and a humiliation like that would have broken me. It would have sent me fleeing into the night in tears. But tonight, I didn't flinch. I didn't take a single step back. Eleanor didn't realize she was striking a ghost. The weak, helpless girl she had tortured back then was long dead. I slowly turned my head back to face her, standing tall with absolute authority. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a senior financial inspector for the Internal Revenue Service, walking straight into a den of the city's biggest suspects. Before Eleanor could scream another word, a heavy, rough hand clamped down on my left elbow. My father, Arthur Sterling, the master manipulator who viewed his children as nothing more than PR tools, had appeared. He completely ignored the bruise on my face. His only concern was public optics. "Get her out of here," Arthur hissed through his teeth, panicking as he signaled 2 private security guards. He leaned into my ear, his breath reeking of expensive scotch. "You will not ruin tonight, Clara. Get out through the service door right now and crawl back to whatever gutter you came from." He wanted to throw me out through the trash exit, exactly the way he had kicked me out onto the street 11 years ago. He thought he was still the king holding all the keys to this empire. What foolish Arthur didn't know was that sitting right next to the main stage was his guest of honor, Governor Julian Vance, a man who respected my forensic auditing skills for a long time. And the leather portfolio under my arm didn't contain a plea for forgiveness. It held a federal blueprint for the destruction of the Sterling Empire. As the guards closed in, I brushed their hands away, looking my father dead in the eye with an icy, mocking smile. "I'm not going anywhere, Arthur, and if I were you, I'd check my phone right now." 11 years ago, long before the IRS badge, I was just a 24-year-old finance student at Columbia University, and I was absolutely terrified. I had just found out I was pregnant with my daughter, Lily. The father vanished the second he saw the positive test, leaving me completely on my own. But that wasn't the only thing keeping me awake at night. As the top student in my class, I had been helping my father, Arthur, look over the early financial records for his new charity, the Sterling Legacy Fund. I wasn't just checking his math. I found massive discrepancies. Millions of dollars meant for inner-city youth centers were dissolving into untraceable consulting firms. Honestly, I was naive. I brought the digital spreadsheets straight to my stepmother, Eleanor, thinking she would want to fix it. I didn't realize she'd spent the last 17 years looking for any excuse to cut my biological mother's bloodline out of the family fortune. When I showed her the missing funds, Eleanor didn't panic. She actually smiled. That very night, she convinced my father that I was unstable, greedy, and plotting to blackmail him to steal the family empire. My pregnancy wasn't a tragedy to her. It was the perfect weapon. An hour later, they called me into my father's private study. The room smelled of heavy leather. On the mahogany desk, Arthur and Eleanor had laid out 3 things: a confirmation letter for an abortion appointment under a fake name, a strict non-disclosure agreement, and a one-way flight to Paris. My father stood by the window with his back to me, while Eleanor stood by the desk, tapping her nails on the papers. "You have disrupted the family portrait, Clara," Eleanor said, her voice completely cold. "Sign the agreement, handle the little mistake at the clinic tomorrow morning, and get on the plane. You can return when we decide you are ready." I looked at the documents, then down at my stomach. I felt a sudden fierce need to protect the tiny life growing inside me. And I also realized what that NDA really was. It wasn't just to hide a pregnancy. It was a legal muzzle so I could never speak about the missing millions I had uncovered. "No," I said. My voice didn't shake. "I'm keeping my baby, and I won't sign your silence." Arthur finally turned around. The look in his eyes was pure malice. "If you walk out that door, you leave with nothing," he barked. "You are stripped from the trust. You are no longer a Sterling." They threw me out before sunrise. But their cruelty didn't stop at the front door. They needed a permanent shield for their financial crimes. If auditors ever discovered the empty accounts, they needed someone to take the fall. So Eleanor and my father told our relatives, our investors, and the media a perfect lie: that I had developed a severe addiction, stolen millions from the charity, and run away in disgrace. They turned me into a scapegoat to buy their own immunity. I left that mansion with 1 suitcase, a box of my late mother's old finance textbooks, and 0 money. The next few years were a lesson in basic survival. I ended up in Queens, renting a cramped, damp basement apartment that smelled of radiator fluid and mold. There were nights when the pipes froze, and I had to wrap Lily in 3 layers of blankets, holding her against my chest while she ran a fever, listening to her cry until she finally exhausted herself. I worked 12-hour shifts as an overnight data entry clerk. During the day, while Lily slept in a portable crib next to my desk, I devoured those old textbooks. I didn't just study to pass exams, I studied to build an unshakable armor. Whenever the exhaustion threatened to break me, I looked at Lily's face, and I remembered my biological mother. She was an honest woman who believed that integrity was the only true inheritance. I chose to raise Lily with that exact worldview. I refused to let her grow up believing that money can buy a conscience. I didn't seek revenge through screaming matches or internet rumors. I chose the law. I won a scholarship, excelled in forensic accounting, and eventually climbed the ranks to become a senior financial inspector for the Internal Revenue Service. For 11 years, my family used my name as a shield for their greed, thinking the broken 24-year-old girl would never return to challenge their narrative. They thought the broken girl would never return. They forgot that numbers never lie. 6 months before the gala, the ghost of my past walked into my IRS office. I was at my desk at the Criminal Investigation Division when my assistant told me a woman was waiting in the lobby. She refused to give her name, but insisted she had a personal delivery for me. When I stepped out, I saw a woman clutching a faded trench coat, nervously scanning the room. I recognized her instantly, Sarah Jenkins. She had been the head accountant for the Sterling Legacy Fund for 15 years. Long before I was kicked out, Sarah was the one who quietly managed the books, and she used to look out for me when I stayed late studying at the office. We went into a private room, and the moment the door shut, she broke down. "They fired me, Clara," she whispered, shaking with fear. "2 weeks ago, Eleanor caught me looking at the offshore routing numbers. They locked me out of my office, threatened my family, and threw me out, but they didn't realize I had already copied the master server." Sarah pulled a small black external hard drive from her pocket and set it on the table. "Everything is in here," she said. "The real ledgers, the shell companies, and the proof of how they stole from the most vulnerable people in this country." That night, after I put Lily to bed, I plugged the drive into my laptop. Sarah's files revealed massive corporate fraud. Over the last 7 years, the Sterling Legacy Fund had publicly raised $24 million for youth shelters across New York. But according to the encrypted transactions, $18 million of that money had been completely drained. The funds didn't go to shelters. They were routed through fake consulting firms straight into a luxury estate account owned entirely by my half-sister Audrey. While I was rebuilding my life from nothing, my younger sister was living a pristine Manhattan luxury life funded directly by stolen charity money. But as I scrolled deeper into the older files, dating back 11 years, my heart completely stopped. There, on a series of fraudulent bank authorization forms from the exact week I was kicked out of my father's house, was my name, Clara Sterling. I stared at the screen, zooming in on the signatures. It looked exactly like my handwriting, down to the slight slant on the letter S, but I'd never seen these documents in my life. In that freezing room, the full horror of what they did finally hit me. When my father and stepmother dragged me into that study 11 years ago, they didn't just banish me for being pregnant or to hide a social embarrassment. They were already setting up the structure for their multi-million-dollar tax evasion and embezzlement schemes. They didn't just erase me from the family, they kept my legal identity alive inside their financial system to use as a permanent shield. If the federal government ever investigated them, the entire trail of breadcrumbs would lead straight back to the eldest daughter who had supposedly run away with stolen money. I was their perfect built-in fall guy. They used my name and my forged signature to authorize the very first illegal transactions that built their empire. They left me to starve in a freezing basement apartment with a sick baby while using my ghost to sign off on their stolen millions. Looking at those forged documents, a chilling realization hit me. In a narcissistic family, love doesn't exist. The moment I refused to comply, they turned me into a weapon. I closed my laptop, sat in the dark, and listened to the quiet rhythm of my daughter's breathing from the next room. The tears I'd held back for 11 years finally dried up,
replaced by absolute clarity. My family spent over a decade using my name to commit crimes. Now it was time to use my real authority to give them exactly what they paid for.
Back in the ballroom, Arthur's grip tightened on my arm, but before his guards could touch me, a deep voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem here, Arthur?" The security guards froze. My father's grip on my arm instantly loosened. Walking toward us was Governor Julian Vance, the guest of honor. The governor is a pragmatist, a sharp political figure who values the rule of law. He wasn't just a face on a campaign poster. He knew exactly who I was. "Governor Vance," Arthur stammered, instantly plastering on his fake smile. "Nothing to worry about, just a family matter. My estranged daughter here is a bit unstable. We are having security escort her out for her own safety." Governor Vance didn't look at Arthur. He looked straight at me, his eyes dropping to my charcoal business suit and the heavy leather portfolio locked under my arm. 2 years ago, when I led a federal task force against a corporate tax fraud syndicate in Albany, Governor Vance personally shook my hand. He knew my reputation. He knew that when Senior Financial Inspector Clara Sterling enters a room, a crime scene has already been established. "Unstable?" Governor Vance asked, his voice echoing clearly for the nearby tables to hear. "That's an interesting way to describe one of the top forensic auditors at the Internal Revenue Service, Arthur. Inspector Sterling and I have worked together before. Her presence is usually a sign that someone's books are about to catch fire." Arthur's face turned gray. Beside him, my stepmother Eleanor gasped, her perfect Manhattan poise cracking as she stared at my IRS credentials peeking out of my suit pocket. "Inspector?" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. You're a clerk?" "Not anymore, Eleanor," I said, stepping forward so the front tables could hear me. 6 months ago, a federal grand jury signed a sealed indictment based on the financial records of the Sterling Legacy Fund. I'm not here as your daughter. I am here as a federal officer executing a lawful investigation." Right at that exact second, the silence of the ballroom shattered, not by music, but by a sound that made my stomach tighten with satisfaction. Buzz, buzz, buzz. It started with a single phone on the table closest to the stage, then another, then 5 more. Within 10 seconds, a chorus of digital vibrations rippled through the audience. 200 elite guests, politicians, and corporate donors simultaneously reached into their purses and pockets. I didn't need to look at my own screen to know what they were reading. Instead of playing a childish game and hacking the museum's projectors, I spent the last 2 weeks coordinating directly with the federal prosecutor's office and senior investigative journalists at the New York Times. The timing was calibrated with mathematical precision. At exactly 9:15 p.m., while my father was attempting to throw me out, the front page of the New York Times digital edition updated globally. The headline burned in bold letters across 200 screens. "Inside the Sterling Fraud: How a Manhattan Billionaire Ripped Off Homeless Youth for an $18 million Luxury Empire." The article didn't just contain allegations, it featured interactive flowcharts showing the exact routing numbers, the phantom consulting firms, and the forged signatures used to drain the charity funds directly into my half-sister Audrey's private accounts. But the real killing blow was the media imagery embedded in the text. Right there on the screen were side-by-side photos. On the left, the glossy brochures of the Sterling Hope Center, a state-of-the-art facility promised to vulnerable runaway children. On the right, the reality: exclusive investigative drone footage of a rotting, abandoned warehouse in upstate New York, overgrown with weeds and filled with rusted oil drums that my family claimed as a completed project. A collective, horrified murmur rose from the crowd. People began stepping backwards away from our family circle, as if the Sterling name had suddenly become contagious.
Guests who begged for a photo with my father minutes ago were now staring at him with absolute disgust. Arthur's hands began to shake so violently he dropped his glass of scotch. It shattered on the marble floor, the amber liquid soaking into the hem of Eleanor's white gown. The security guards backed away from me completely, realizing touching a federal agent on the eve of a massive public exposure was a one-way ticket to a federal prison cell. I looked at my father, whose breathing had become shallow and panicked, and then at Eleanor, who was frantically scrolling through the images of the rotting warehouse on her phone. The trap was sprung. The fortress they built out of lies and stolen money was collapsing in real time, and there was no back door big enough for them to hide in. The press conference at the Federal Plaza starts in 20 minutes, Arthur. I suggest you find your lawyers.
If you want to understand the true nature of a narcissistic family, don't look at how they treat their victims. Look at how they treat each other when the ship starts to sink. The grand ballroom instantly transformed from a high society gala into a chaotic war zone. The hundreds of wealthy donors who had been smiling for photographs seconds ago were now recoiling in disgust, their faces illuminated by the harsh blue light of their smartphones. The Sterling name turned into poison in a matter of seconds. My father, Arthur Sterling, stared down at the shattered glass of scotch at his feet, his chest heaving. For a man who worshipped his public image, the sudden hum of 200 phones was the sound of his execution. But a cornered narcissist never accepts defeat. They just look for a scapegoat. Arthur bolted toward the main stage, pushing past the panicked violinists, and yanked the microphone from its stand. A sharp screech of audio feedback pierced through the room, forcing everyone to look up. "Everyone, please listen to me," Arthur bellowed, his voice trembling as he forced a tear down his cheek. "What you are seeing on your screens is an absolute tragedy, a federal crime, but I stand here tonight completely blindsided. I am a victim of my own blind trust." I stood near the exit with my arms crossed, watching the man who raised me completely abandon his humanity in real time. "I had absolutely no operational knowledge of these shadow accounts," Arthur cried, pointing a shaking finger directly at the front VIP table. "I trusted the wrong person with our family's charity. I trusted my youngest daughter, Audrey Sterling. She was the sole administrator of those accounts. My only flaw was loving her too much to suspect she was bleeding our foundation dry for her own luxury. Tomorrow, I will resign to help the FBI, but Audrey must answer for what she did to this family." The ballroom went completely breathless. It was a public execution. To save his own skin, Arthur was throwing his golden child straight into a federal prison cell without a single second of hesitation. But he made one fatal mistake. He forgot that a mother lion will protect her cub, even if both of them are monsters. My stepmother, Eleanor, went completely rigid. The aristocratic smile she'd practiced for 30 years disintegrated into pure rage. Seeing her biological daughter publicly slaughtered by her husband snapped the final thread holding their fake marriage together. Eleanor snapped. "You lying piece of garbage," Eleanor screamed, her voice cracking the elegant atmosphere as she charged the stage. She grabbed a silver ice bucket from a catering table and hurled it onto the stage, sending ice and shattered glass flying everywhere. "How dare you blame my daughter? How dare you hide behind a 28-year-old girl to save your own pathetic skin, Arthur?" Before the security guards could react, Audrey herself broke through the crowd. Audrey had spent her whole life inside a gilded cage, playing the perfect daughter while I was erased from the family history. But hearing her father destroy her life on a public stage broke her mind. Her expensive silk dress was stepped on and torn as she scrambled up the stage stairs, her heavy black mascara running down her face.
Audrey snatched the podium microphone, her voice vibrating with a mix of hysteria and hatred. "You authorized every single wire transfer, Dad," Audrey shrieked into the speakers, her voice booming over the sound system. "You think you can just erase me like you erased Clara? Every single month, you sat in your leather chair and ordered me to sign those papers. You told me it was legal asset protection. You told me it was how billionaires stay rich." "Shut your mouth, Audrey," Arthur hissed, dropping his microphone to his chest, his eyes wide with terror. "She's hysterical. Guards, get her off this stage." "No, look at him," Audrey screamed louder, turning directly to the crowd of politicians and billionaires. "My mother forged the youth shelter brochures. She took pictures of a real charity in New Jersey and photoshopped them onto that rotting, empty warehouse upstate. Dad knew everything. He laughed about it. He said the public was too stupid to check the actual addresses. They didn't just trick me, they did it to Clara 11 years ago. They stole her identity first." From the center of the room, I watched the entire dynasty devour itself without me having to move a single finger. They were predators wearing designer masks, turning on each other for survival. The very moment the lights come on, they will gladly eat their own children alive just to breathe for one more minute. I didn't say a word. I didn't smile. I just held my leather portfolio tight against my ribs, watching the monsters destroy each other without me having to move a single finger.
There's a specific kind of silence that happens right after a bomb goes off. It is the moment before the screaming starts, when the smoke is still clearing and everyone realizes that everything they built is completely gone. On the stage of the museum, the microphones were still live, broadcasting the panicked breathing of Arthur, Eleanor, and Audrey to the entire room. But the shouting stopped. The family drama was abruptly cut short by a heavy, rhythmic sound echoing from the grand entrance. Thud, thud, thud. Heavy, tactical boots. The double doors of the ballroom were pushed wide open. A dozen federal agents in dark navy windbreakers with IRS-CI and FBI stamped across their backs marched into the room. They moved with the cold precision of a sweeping net. Standing at the front of the line was Special Agent Marcus Vance, my direct supervisor, who spent the last 6 months signing off on my covert audits. "Federal officers, nobody leave the room," Marcus's voice boomed through the high ceilings. Eleanor tried to play her final card. She clutched her pearl necklace, let out a dramatic gasp, and began to sway backward, pretending she was about to faint right onto the stage. It was the classic high society defense mechanism, a fake medical emergency to avoid handcuffs. But 2 female agents caught her by the arms before she could touch the floor. They didn't offer her smelling salts. They offered her steel. "Save the performance for the judge, Mrs. Sterling," one of the agents said, her voice completely flat as she clicked a pair of handcuffs around Eleanor's wrists. Arthur tried to step back toward the curtains, but Marcus was already there, blocking the exit with 2 armed marshals. The billionaire's hands were forced behind his back, his expensive watch reflecting the flashing police lights filtering in from the glass ceiling. As the handcuffs clicked into place, the real collapse began. It wasn't a loud explosion, it was a quiet, brutal abandonment. One by one, the wealthy elites of Manhattan began to detach themselves from the sinking ship. At the front table, a major real estate mogul who had spent the last 3 hours praising my father's philanthropy stood up. Without saying a single word, he reached onto his tuxedo lapel, unpinned the gold Sterling Legacy Fund donor badge, and placed it quietly on the white tablecloth next to his half-empty champagne glass. Then a prominent female senator did the same. Clink. The small gold pin hit the ceramic plate. Then another billionaire. Then an entire table of corporate sponsors. It was a silent desertion.
No one looked at Arthur, no one defended Eleanor. They just unpinned their badges, left them on the tables like trash, and walked past the federal agents with their heads down. The multi-million-dollar network my family had spent 30 years building vanished in less than 3 minutes. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my sleeve. I turned around. It was Eleanor. The agents were letting her walk past me toward the exit, but she had used the last ounce of her strength to lunge toward me. Her hair was a mess, her makeup was ruined by sweat and tears. The cold, untouchable queen of the Upper East Side was gone. In her place was a desperate criminal looking for a loophole. "Clara, please," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking, her fingers clawing at my suit jacket. "Your father and we made mistakes, but we did it to secure the future, for everyone, for you." I didn't pull away. I just stood there, looking down at her hands in steel cuffs. "You cannot use my daughter as a bargaining chip for your silence, Eleanor," I said, each word hitting like a hammer. I leaned down so only she could hear me, my eyes locking onto hers with absolute finality. My child had value the exact second she was born into this world, not when your empire started burning to the ground. She doesn't need your stolen charity money, and she certainly doesn't need your toxic name. I stepped back, nodding slightly to the 2 female agents. "Take her away." Eleanor let out a sharp, choked sob as the agents dragged her toward the double doors. I watched her go, then turned back to the empty ballroom. The tables were covered in abandoned gold badges, shining under the museum lights, completely worthless.
3 months can feel like a lifetime. In just 90 days, everything the Sterlings built was gone. Arthur and Eleanor were indicted on multiple federal counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and identity theft. The judge denied them bail. Their Manhattan townhouse was padlocked and taped off with yellow federal seals. During all of this, I only agreed to one request. I agreed to meet my half-sister Audrey one last time inside a glass-walled interrogation room at the Federal Plaza. When the door clicked open, the glamorous socialite who used to look down on me was gone. Audrey was sitting at a metal table in a standard gray federal jumpsuit. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She just looked incredibly small. When she saw me walk in, she started crying. "Clara, thank you for coming. I didn't think you'd actually show up." I sat down across from her. I didn't smile, but I wasn't angry either. "This is official business, Audrey. I'm here to review your final statement before your plea deal goes to the judge. This is not a social visit." Audrey buried her face in her hands. "I know," she sobbed. 11 years ago, when Mom and Dad dragged you into that study, I was the one who hid those fraudulent withdrawal slips in your bedroom. I helped them frame you. I watched them throw you out when you were pregnant, and I didn't say a word." "I know you did," I said, keeping my voice steady. "The digital timestamps on the server proved you accessed the files from your laptop." "I did it because I hated you," she confessed, her voice rising. "Mom spent my entire childhood whispering in my ear. She told me you were the golden child from the first marriage. She told me if I didn't destroy you, Dad would leave everything to you. I was consumed by the jealousy she poured into my head every single day." She stopped and looked around the empty room. "But do you want to know the joke, Clara? The moment you left, the cage closed around me. I thought I won, but I became their prisoner. Every dress, every car they bought me was a bribe to do their dirty work. They made me sign those fake shelter wire transfers. If I ever questioned Dad about the money, he'd just say, 'Remember what happened to Clara? Do you want to end up on the street like her?' They used you to keep me compliant. They used you to control me." She leaned across the table. "I was a puppet. I was manipulated by them just like you were. Please, I need you to forgive me.
If you tell the prosecutor I was brainwashed, my sentence gets cut in half." I looked at my half-sister. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, the golden child begging for mercy. But looking at her now, I didn't feel joy. I just felt closure. "Knowing Eleanor manipulated you explains why you were so cruel," I said into the recording microphones. "But her manipulation doesn't make your actions my responsibility to forgive." Audrey froze. "You were a victim of a narcissistic family system, yes, but 11 years ago, you chose to protect your luxury lifestyle at the expense of your homeless sister. You chose to sign those fraudulent documents for 7 years while homeless children starved. You were an adult, Audrey. You chose the gold chains." I stood up and looked down at her. "Your healing cannot be bought by lowering my boundaries. You must stand before the judge and take full responsibility for your actions." I walked out of the glass room, leaving her to face the sentence she earned.
The federal courtroom in Manhattan was packed to absolute capacity, buzzing with the restless energy of reporters, disgraced investors, and independent observers eager to witness the final fall of New York's most untouchable dynasty. When Arthur and Eleanor were led to the courtroom, the contrast with their former grandeur was staggering. Gone were the custom-tailored Brioni suits and the priceless vintage silk gowns. In their place hung coarse, standardized orange jumpsuits. Arthur walked with a heavy, defeated shuffle, looking 10 years older, his arrogant posture completely broken. Eleanor kept her face stubbornly turned toward the floor, her hair half unpinned, desperately trying to shield her tear-streaked face from the flashing lenses of the press gallery. When the bailiff called my name to the witness stand, a sharp hush fell over the room. I walked up the steps with measured, unhurried precision. I wore my sharpest charcoal blazer, my IRS CI badge pinned securely to my lapel. As I placed my hand on the binder containing the complete forensic audits, I looked out across the gallery. I didn't see powerful billionaires or high society gatekeepers anymore. I just saw people who had forgotten that truth has an expiration date. "State your name and occupation for the record," the federal prosecutor instructed gently. "Senior Financial Inspector Clara Sterling, IRS Criminal Investigation Division," I replied, my voice echoing clearly through the courtroom's microphones. Over the next hour, I didn't need to raise my voice or rely on emotional appeals. The math spoke for itself. I presented the court with clear, irrefutable digital maps of the shell companies, the phantom consulting firms, the doctored youth shelter brochures, and the exact paper trail of forged signatures dating back 11 years. I walked the judge and jury through the systematic destruction of $24 million meant for vulnerable, homeless children, money diverted straight into luxury real estate and offshore accounts to fund Audrey's lifestyle and my father's empire. At the defense table, Arthur tried to interrupt once, whispering frantically to his court-appointed defense attorney, but his lawyer just wearily shook his head, knowing every avenue of escape had been permanently sealed. When I stepped down from the witness stand and returned to my seat in the gallery, the judge delivered the verdict without a moment of hesitation. "Arthur Sterling, for the charges of grand larceny, systemic wire fraud, identity theft, and tax evasion, you were sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Eleanor Sterling, for complicity, document forgery, and money laundering, you are sentenced to 10 years. The sharp bang of the judge's gavel signaled the end. There were no gasps of surprise, no dramatic outbursts, just the heavy collective exhale of a courtroom realizing that justice had finally caught up. As the marshals stepped forward to snap the handcuffs back onto my father and stepmother, Arthur raised his head for a single, fleeting second. His eyes met mine across the courtroom. There was no defiance left in them,
only the cold, paralyzing terror of a man who finally realized his ghost had come back to collect. The Sterling dynasty didn't end with a grand explosion. It ended in a quiet, sterile room under fluorescent lights, silenced by the unyielding weight of the truth.
The bronze plaque on the building on Fifth Avenue doesn't say the Sterling Legacy Fund anymore. It doesn't have the family name on it at all. Following the convictions, every single asset seized by my father's fake corporations was dissolved. Every dollar was funneled directly into a brand new initiative, the Harbor House Project, a real, functioning shelter for homeless youth. No fake brochures, no rotting warehouses. They offered to carve my name into the main entrance wall to honor the auditor who uncovered the fraud, but I told them no. A true sanctuary doesn't need a billionaire's ego on the wall. It just needs to keep the children safe. 6 months after the trial, I was sitting at my desk in my small, sunlit apartment, reviewing the final closure files. The room was completely quiet except for the steady ticking of the wall clock. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Then the mail slot in my front door rattled. Clack. A single white envelope fell onto the floor. I walked over and picked it up. There was no return address, just a stamped serial number from the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. It was from my stepmother, Eleanor. Even from a prison cell, she was still trying to pull the strings. My dearest Clara, the conditions here are unbearable. My lawyers tell me that a letter of leniency from you, as the lead federal inspector, could convince the parole board to reduce my sentence. You must understand, Clara, I was a victim too. Your father forced me to sign those brochures. He threatened to leave me with nothing if I didn't help him hide the money. I only did it to survive. Please, for the sake of the family, write the letter. I stared at her words. There was no apology for framing me 11 years ago. There was no remorse for leaving Lily and me to starve in the cold. She was just rewriting history to shift the blame onto a dying husband. I didn't get angry. I walked into the kitchen, held the letter over the trash can, and let it go. Drop. It hit the bottom of the bin right on top of the morning coffee grounds. The past was exactly where it belonged, in the garbage. I checked my watch. 3 p.m. It was time. I grabbed my keys and drove down the block to the elementary school. The bell was ringing just as I pulled up to the curb. A crowd of children burst through the double doors, and there she was, my 7-year-old daughter, Lily. She had my dark hair and a bright, unstoppable smile. The moment she spotted my car, her face lit up. "Mommy!" Lily shouted, running across the sidewalk. She threw her arms around my waist. I lifted her up and held her tightly against my chest. "Hey, baby, how was your day?" "I drew a picture of our house in art class," she said, buckling herself into the back seat and holding up a drawing. "Look, I used the brightest crayon for the sun." "It's beautiful, Lily," I said, looking at her in the rearview mirror. "Let's go home." We drove through the quiet, tree-lined streets of our neighborhood, away from the concrete towers of Manhattan and the ghosts of Fifth Avenue. When we got to our small, 2-story house, Lily ran up the porch steps, waiting for me at the front door. I took out my brass key and slid it into the lock. Click. The doors swung open, revealing our living room. The afternoon sun poured through the windows, painting the hardwood floors in a warm, golden light. There were no grand marble pillars and no security guards, but it was ours. Every single brick was paid for by honest work. Lily ran toward the kitchen to get a glass of juice. I stepped inside behind her, reached for the heavy deadbolt on the door, and turned it. Clack. The lock engaged, sealing the outside world away, locked completely from the inside. When the people who call themselves your family only beg for your mercy after their plastic thrones have completely turned to ash, what do? Do you open the door to let the vipers back in, or do you lock it tight to protect the peace you nearly died to build? A real legacy isn't an inheritance passed down through blood money and forged signatures. It isn't a family name stamped on a museum wall. A real legacy is built by hand, through truth, resilience, and the courage to survive the dark. My name is Clara, and my daughter and I are finally safe. And that brings our story to a close. Some collapses look like tragedies at first glance, but they turn out to be the only way to clear away the debris and finally build a life grounded in truth. What about you? If you were standing before a relationship or a structure in your own life that you knew was built on hollow ground, would you keep trying to hold it up, or would you find the courage to let it fall and start over? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and follow Sweet Payback for more stories like this. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video.